Welcome everyone. My name is Inge Graaf. I'm Associate Professor of Competition Law at TILT, the institute after which this conference is named, and I'm also affiliated to TILEC, the Tilburg Law and Economics Center. And I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Anu Bradford to you, our keynote speaker for the Competition and Market Regulation track of this conference. And Anu is an Henry L. Moses Professor of Law and International Organization at Columbia Law School. She's a leading scholar on the EU regulatory power, and probably she's most well known for coining the term the Brussels effect to describe the impact that the EU has on global markets by setting regulations and policy worldwide. And in this context, she has also published a book last year on the Brussels effect and how the European Union rules the world. But beyond this, she's also an expert in antitrust law, and one of her main contributions to the antitrust community has been the comparative competition law project that she set up. And this is a project that has built a large data set analyzing antitrust laws across the globe, which really provides a basis for empirical research on how antitrust regimes are shaping markets. So when we invited her to deliver a keynote speech here, I was sort of expecting that she would propose to speak about one or a combination of these projects, which are both really interesting and have also been influential. But when accepting our invitation, she actually told me that she already had moved on to working on yet another project about the regulation of the digital economy, on which she could already share some insights. And the topic that she proposed to talk about, the future of the liberal democracy against the background of the digital economy, actually fits very well with the overall theme of the conference, which is regulating in times of crisis, because of course, we are still currently living in a health and in an economic crisis, but once this crisis has been overcome, probably some of the most pressing concerns and challenges that the pandemic has made even more visible than before will remain, such as concerns relating to surveillance and also the power of just a handful of digital platforms on which we are becoming increasingly dependent. So taking us beyond the current crisis, Anu's speech will also allow us to reflect on these wider challenges that have a global relevance and where we see that different jurisdictions around the world are taking different regulatory approaches. So before I pass the words on to Anu, just a few words on how this session is organized. So after her talk, we will also have some time for questions. So you can already share your questions during her talk in the Zoom chat. And I will then select a few and let you pose your question to her yourself. So I think with that, we are ready to get started. Thanks again, Anu, for accepting to speak here, and happy to give you the floor now.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Inge, and really pleasure to share the conversation with all of you. And as Inge mentioned, this is a very new project, and it's a real treat then to be able to share some very early thoughts and ideas that I have. And I really hope that we can make some progress in taking this conversation further in our today's time together. So I do want to talk about crises and the crisis of liberal democracy and the role of internet platform is in shaping our societies. I'll be mainly focusing on the European Union, but I also want to contrast the way the EU views the regulatory approach and the right way to regulate the platforms to the approach embraced by the United States and China. So if we think about the fundamental promise of internet, the promise was really that it would bring us freedom. Freedom to access information, freedom to exercise voice, participate in debates, and shape our societies. Ideally, these internet platforms are guardians and amplifiers of those freedoms, They would enhance the democracy by providing this kind of inclusive platform for diverse voices around the world. The reality, however, shows that this promise of freedom is incomplete at best. Internet has also exposed vast segments of the society to different forms of harmful content. Internet has become a platform for disinformation, for hatred, for bullying, and for repulsive content that is undermining the safety and the dignity of the individuals, while also dividing our societies, as opposed to bringing us together in this new public sphere. So in many ways, the way we govern the digital economy determines which element and which values underlying the internet will prevail, and whether digital economy in the end will enhance or undermine liberal democracy and individual freedom. So let me lay out what I think are the three fundamental models that have now emerged as shaping our regulation of the platforms. So one is this American approach, which relies on what I would call this techno-libertarian idea. The idea that markets know the best and the platforms can largely govern themselves. Then we have the Chinese view that is in stark opposition to the techno-libertarian view in being much more state-centric. It's the state that governs as opposed to the markets. It is more of a digital authoritarian view where internet is harnessed as the tool for control. The Europeans are asserting themselves in this debate and in this regulatory battle with a European view towards regulation. So instead of embracing this techno-libertarian market-based vision or the Chinese digital authoritarian state knows the best vision, the European vision is much more rights and values centric, focusing really on the fairness and the human-centric notion of a more democratic internet. So different stakeholders have very different view of whether the American or Chinese or the European approach to internet is the correct one. Many US corporations and other stakeholders and the US government criticize the European regulatory overtures, including the online hate speech rules or the right to be forgotten that stems from the General Data Protection Regulation. According to this techno-libertarian view, these regulations undermine free speech and they stifle public debate. So they're not necessarily good for democracy. But to defend its regulations, the EU has plenty to point to in showing the costs of the unregulated techno-libertarian marketplace. We can talk about the Snowden revelations when the US National Security Agency engaged in mass surveillance campaign by harvesting the data from Facebook, or the Cambridge Analytica scandal when a British consulting firm again access the personal data in Facebook and deployed that in micro-targeting in political campaigns, also affecting the outcome of the Brexit referendum and the election of President Trump in 2016. The Europeans can also point to the many instances in every moment where platforms like Twitter or YouTube or Facebook fail to remove dangerous disinformation or repulsive content from online. That remains rampant. And I think it really culminated on January 6th, when there was this assault on the US Capitol following disinformation campaign sustained by these platforms that was really questioning the integrity and the outcome of the presidential election in the United States. So these are some of the criticisms against the American approach in response to the criticism of the Europeans being too forthcoming in regulating. The criticism against the Chinese digital authoritarian model is somewhat different. So Chinese government continues to block and filter content at a very large scale. Many companies, including Google, Facebook, do not operate on that market because of extensive censorship and hacking incidents that they have experienced. China's large-scale deployment of facial recognition technique for law enforcement purposes has also been very unsettling for many observing that from the distance. It's widely condemned abroad. So is the Chinese system of assigning these social credits to individuals based on how they can be observed and monitored online. So when you're committing a crime or whether you're paying your taxes, you are also building your digital profile that can then be used, for instance, to say that you are not eligible to buy a plane ticket. So there is the kind of surveillance regime sustained by internet platforms that is deeply in contradiction to the values underlying a digital, more liberal democratic notion of the digital economy. So let me go now a little deeper into where these values come from and why do the Americans, for instance, embrace a certain notion of internet, why Chinese embrace theirs, and where the European values come from. So this techno-libertarian model in the United States, it really centers on the idea of protecting free speech, free internet, and incentives to innovate. It is part of the broader ideology in the United States that embraces the markets and places less faith in the ability of the government to intervene. The internet pioneers in the United States really argued that there is no space for the government in regulating the internet. There's a famous declaration of the independence of the cyberspace from 1996 by John Perry Barlow, who is a libertarian cyber theorist or a philosopher. And that really sets the tone to this techno-libertarian view that is a very techno-optimist view. The idea that internet needs to be a self-ordering place. And when we leave it at that, it can really thrive. State does have a role when it comes to internet in the United States, but that is mainly in cybersecurity. So state can step in when the internet is discussed in terms of the national security implications. And it's actually interesting if you think about the strong role that the state in the US has been in developing the digital economy. It has funded many of the crucial innovations behind the information technology revolution. So the origins of iPhone can even be traced back to the US Defense Department program. But even though the US government has been crucial in funding the many of these innovations, it is not central in now regulating them. So the US model really has resulted in this self-regulatory model where the platforms are the governors of the internet, where they are the real sovereigns or the custodians of the internet, as some of the scholars have very eloquently explained. So let me now shift to China. And if we think about the Chinese digital authoritarianism, it really reflects the Chinese Model 2 goals. So one goal that the Chinese government has is to maximize the country's technological dominance, while then maintaining social harmony and control over its citizens' communications. So China is very determined to leverage technology towards its growth and development. It is engaged in a massive capacity building effort geared at making China the dominant technology superpower by 2030. We talk about economic dominance, but we also talk about geopolitical power that comes with such dominance. When China regulates platforms, it is also looking to tighten the grip of the Chinese Communist Party. It is leveraging internet as a tool for surveillance and control. And it is harnessing the private platforms as the proxies of the state in surveilling the citizens using the internet. So these companies have enjoyed extensive freedom from regulation so that they can grow and innovate and support this goal of Chinese technology power and excellence. In return, what they owe to the state is their cooperation. And they are the ones that are carrying out a lot of the surveillance and giving the Chinese state the data that they need in order to know what are the conversations that are taking place. So citizens in China are very much given this security narrative that it is in their interest that state is monitoring internet. The discourse in China, obviously very much manufactured by the state, is really focusing on how state protects them from the dark side of the internet, how state is enhancing their personal security and social peace. There would be a chaos if state was not stepping in. So it's really a reflection of a culture that prioritizes social order over individual freedoms. So if we think about this American way to think about the internet and the Chinese way, let me now come into what is the European response and how Europe differs from those. So the EU is very much focused on advancing a human-centric notion of internet. This kind of democracy-enhancing, redistributive approach to a fair digital economy that really puts the values and individual rights at the center. And I would say that there are 5 goals that the EU has in regulating internet. And these 5 goals really penetrate all the areas of the EU regulation of the big technology, whether we talk about antitrust or privacy or cybersecurity, digital tax, whether we talk about online speech or online copyright, artificial intelligence. These are the 5 values that I think are very much advancing and informing the regulatory agenda. So the first one is democracy. The EU really wants to harness the democracy-enhancing potential of the internet and suppress the ways that internet can also undermine the democratic structures of the society. The second goal for the EU is to advance fairness and distribution, the solidarity, create a much more fair marketplace and divide the gains from digital economy more equally. The third value that I would highlight is the commitment to fundamental rights. So if we think about personal privacy, it is really, in the EU language, a fundamental human right. And this rights approach is very central to all the areas, whether we talk about the new AI regulation and what ethical AI is supposed to be like. The fourth goal that is also everywhere, not just in the digital economy, but everything that the EU regulates, is the goal to advance European integration. And the EU is very focused on complementing its gains in other areas of integration with a real, true digital single market. So all the EU's regulatory efforts are also geared at reducing fragmentation and creating a more European approach to platform economy. And the fifth goal that I would emphasize is a little bit more recent goal, but that is very much part of the conversation today. And that is the focus on digital sovereignty and the EU's global influence. But this idea that the EU needs to reduce its dependencies from the others and to be able to make its own choices in a digital economy. So those are what I would say the main focuses of the EU. And if we look at how those values, for instance, operate, let me take one area and focus a little bit on online speech. So the Digital Services Act is pending right now before the EU institutions. There's a massive global conversations of the boundaries of speech online. So let's look a little bit deeper. What are the EU's values that are shaping its regulation of the online platforms moderation of the speech? So we can talk about the EU's focus on hate speech or terrorist content or disinformation. The default has been, and this is a little bit more techno-libertarian notion, is that there is no general monitoring obligation. The EU has given the platforms the safe harbor and the platform immunity until they know, they become aware of the kind of harmful content. And thus far, the EU has mainly regulated this space with voluntary codes. So there's been a hate speech code or the disinformation code that the EU has signed with the leading platforms, where these platforms have agreed to take down hate speech, for instance, that violates the code within the 24 hours. And they are reporting very high takedown rates. So it is not that these voluntary codes have not led to an adjustment in the platform's behavior. That said, very few people would say that internet today and all these platforms are free of disinformation or hate speech. They may be taking it down, but there's plenty still out there. There's also new regulation that was very recently approved on removing the terrorist propaganda, where these platforms need to remove terrorist content within an hour from learning about that content. Now this approach in the EU is shifting. It's really tightening the screws of regulation with the Digital Services Act. We are moving from voluntary codes to mandatory regulation backed by extensive sanctions. At the same time, the Digital Services Act still does not tell you what kind of speech is harmful, what kind of speech should stay. It is more creating the kind of constitutional foundation, almost a due process rules, transparency, accountability provisions, so that we know how the platforms go about these decisions, and we can protect through procedural rights any individual's ability to contest, for instance, the decisions that the platforms are making about the content. So what would explain then the EU's focus on removing all this harmful content, even though the EU is fundamentally committed to freedom of expression, which is also the reason why it is not imposing these monitoring obligations in a general sense to the platforms. It is really the European history that informs European view to content such as hate speech. Europe knows through its history of racist and xenophobic violence what hate speech can do. If you think about the hatred incited towards Jews leading up to the Second World War, the Europeans are much more conscious of surveillance through the internet. If you think about the surveillance regimes under the former communist countries. So Europeans are much more sensitive on whether we need to curtail speech that no longer advances individual dignity and democracy, but at the same time, we need to be careful that we do not have the government start censoring the individual freedom when it comes to speech. Removing terrorist propaganda. There's been several terrorist incidents on the European soil, often then amplified by the terrorist recruiting that takes place online. The citizens are growing increasingly uncomfortable reporting so many incidents of harmful content that they encounter on the daily basis when using social media. There's been massive experiences of disinformation campaign, whether we think about Russian role in the Brexit referendum or disinformation more generally. So there are many impulses that are getting the Europeans to act. There's also this concern that if the EU doesn't act, the individual member states are acting, as Germany has already moved ahead with its own content regulation, and France as well. So if the Europeans want a European approach, there really needs to be, for instance, the Digital Services Act. So let's go into those 5 values a little bit that I talked about, and maybe say a little bit about the role of democracy when it comes to content regulation. So freedom of expression is a cornerstone of a European notion of democracy. But the EU thinks that platforms at the same time need to assume responsibility for the content that shape the public space and democracy. And they must be containing the speech that undermines democracy without then suppressing the public speech that healthy democracy depends on. So disinformation, for instance, is a tremendous threat to democracy because democracy depends on well-informed citizens, and disinformation compromises that notion. So disinformation can also lead to polarization that divides the society and makes it harder to reach compromises on critical issues for the society. These platforms, through tolerating the disinformation, have undermined the role of traditional media. And in many ways, the citizens no longer know which information is truthful and which is not, and what kind of journalism they can rely on. So in many ways, we also fear about disinformation compromising the elections. if there is disinformation that questions the integrity of the elections, the worthiness of voting in terms of being able to influence the outcomes. So in many ways, democracy is a central concern every time the EU is regulating speech. And this is where we can draw the starkest contrast to China. China cares about social stability and not democracy. That is the single biggest ideological difference when it comes to regulating the platforms between the EU and China. China maintains an unyielding policy of state surveillance over public speech. And as I mentioned, it has co-opted the private companies in that endeavor. So if you look at some of the Chinese regulation, for instance, the cybersecurity law from 2016, it prohibits the use of networks to conduct any activity that endangers national security, honor, or interest, or incites to subvert the state power or overthrow the socialist system. If you also look at how the Chinese technology companies have been, according to Chinese law, they've been told to remove content that is detrimental to state security and national unification or to state honor, or that would disrupt social order and stability. I think there was a rather illustrative law from 2019 addressed to these video and audio companies, like the Chinese version of the TikTok. So these companies, according to the new 2019 law, shall insist on correct political direction, guidance of public opinion, and value orientation. These private companies need to carry forward core socialist values and promote the formation of positive cyberculture towards kindness. They also cannot then maintain or tolerate any content that would undermine social stability or social order. So I think that is quite illustrative of how the digital authoritarianism is reflected in the laws that guide the regulation of the platforms. As an anecdote, though, it is interesting if we talk about democracy and the platforms in China, that China has been a forerunner in using the citizens' engagement, have a much more democratic governance model when it comes to commercial speech online. So they have actually decentralized a lot of these governance decisions on the platform. So Alibaba, for instance, in 2012, launched this public dispute resolution center, which basically crowdsources the buyers and the sellers to resolve the disputes that arise on the platform. This crowd judging was an immediate hit. Immediately, a year after, there were almost 500,000 buyers and 300,000 sellers that had participated and adjudicated over 300,000 cases. So by the end of 2018, over 4 million users were registered as public jurors, and over 16 million cases had been resolved through this mechanism. This is a very different approach when it comes to anything approaching a political speech, and the Chinese democratic governance model is strictly limited to the commercial sphere in the internet. Compared to the United States, though, Europe and the US are on the same page when it comes to defending democracy as the foundation of internet. They share a very similar commitment. But how they operationalize that in practice is very different. Often the US regulators are less prepared to intervene in the name of democracy because they are worried of curtailing the freedom of speech. That is the key to an American notion of democracy. So the US techno-libertarian view often guides the government to go rather to err on the side of under-regulating rather than overdoing the moderation. And I think this was also quite illustrated if you think about when we have seen an intervention, and a very, very significant one. It was really after the January 6th Capitol riots, when the private platform companies decided to deplatform President Trump and remove him from Twitter and remove him from Facebook. The US government was nowhere to be seen in this decision. This was a private decision, which interestingly was very much criticized by people like Angela Merkel and other European leaders because it wasn't a democratic process through which we were governing the speech online. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to rather talk about these fundamental rights and the other values that are very much part of the European regulation of the online speech. I'm just going to use the democracy value as the way to illustrate it, but we can also talk about that later on. But let me now talk a little bit about why this battle of the different values actually matters. So in many ways, it matters to the companies that are thrust in the middle of these very different visions of regulating the internet. So this contest and the battle of values takes in the era of mounting trade wars and technology wars, where we are entangling the questions of trade and technology and innovation with questions like national security and protectionism and global power politics. And the companies are navigating this environment. So if you have some examples of the companies trying to adjust to the different demands of the governments, think about Apple and Google removing the apps associated with the anti-government protesters in Hong Kong following the demands of the Chinese government. Google tried to build a censored search engine for China in order to be in compliance with Chinese laws, but it backed down following the backlash in the United States, where it faced the criticism that it was capitulating to Chinese censorship demands. Microsoft was asked to hand over personal data stored in servers in Europe for US law enforcement authorities. At the same time, the Europeans said that under GDPR, you cannot give that kind of personal data to the United States. Most recently, we had the Chinese social media company, that owns the TikTok application. It was caught between President Trump saying that you need to sell the company to a US buyer in order to operate in the US market, because there were concerns of surveillance and access by Chinese government to American data. And only then for TikTok to learn that Chinese government issued an order whereby it prohibits the exportation of artificial intelligence outside of China, which would have then endangered and made impossible the very sale of TikTok to an American company. So this is a very difficult environment for private companies to navigate. But why this battle matters even further than that, in the eyes of the government, this is really a question about the economic prominence, the prosperity of their nations. What is the world of technology that will, to a large extent, determine the fortunes of our economies? But when it comes to the digital space, it is also more geopolitical battle. It is the battle about military might and fighting the modern warfare through cybersecurity, for instance. So that is very central. But ultimately, it is also a battle, and the stakes are high, because what is at stake is the model of governance, the future of liberal democracy. Whether we have human-centric capitalism or whether we have surveillance capitalism, whether humans control technology or whether the technology controls and exploits us. And ultimately, whether surveillance capitalism or digital authoritarianism prevails over this foundational value of internet as a bastion and amplifier of democracy and individual freedoms. I'm eager to open this up very soon, so let me just end with the thought of who is winning. And in many ways, I would say that the US is losing the ideological battle. There are very few voices anymore that are fully convinced that we do not need to regulate platforms. They've got it. With every scandal that is unfolding, the Europeans are gaining ground in saying that internet needs to be regulated. We need to have the government step in. The EU has also been most successful in exporting its regulatory models, with many laws like the GDPR becoming global benchmark as the result of what I call the Brussels effect. But I think there are two threats to the EU's ability to prevail. So one is that China is increasingly being successful in exporting the digital authoritarian model. it is building through the Chinese companies, all with connections to Chinese government, are building the telecommunications infrastructure across the developing world, entrenching the Chinese norms in the process. About 60 countries around the world have already accepted the exploitation of Chinese surveillance technologies, which these governments are using for surveillance purposes. So in many ways, the digital authoritarianism is gaining more interest, especially in the eyes of illiberal governments that are seeing it as an opportunity to control their population. The second threat to the EU is that even though the EU values would resonate globally, the EU has had a hard time of entrenching these values in the legislation in the way that fundamentally would shape the digital economy. All these antitrust cases against Google have not really created a more competitive marketplace. We do not have more redistribution really and a more fair digital economy. We have a very hard time ultimately cleaning the internet from hate speech and disinformation, because it is one of the hardest things to try and regulate, because exactly you need to also make sure that you do not overdo it and undermine the freedom of expression. So in many ways, even though we talk about the battle among the governments and the hegemons about their values, the real sovereigns still remain the platforms themselves, these companies that have been able to determine the regulatory environment by the sheer power and the difficulty of truly controlling them. So in many ways, I think it's a battle that continues, and it's the battle with different ideas, different governments, different values, and different players. But what I want to leave you with is the significance of this battle and the kind of society the outcome of this value battle will create. And we certainly no longer today can take for granted that the future of the digital economy would be resting on the foundation of liberal democracy. So let me open it up for questions, and I'd be really eager to hear from all of you.
Thank you very much, Anu. This was a really interesting reflection indeed on how the various policy objectives are reflected in the regulatory choices that are made around the world. I'm just going to see if there is any questions already, so you can post them in the chat, or you can also just raise your hand, and I'm happy to give you the floor. So maybe just to start off, because I was indeed also wondering, like you were explaining towards the end, it seems that some of these choices are not really fixed, although some of it comes from the history and the background and the different policy priorities that are made. And it seems indeed that also in the US, the idea and the need to regulate platforms is becoming more and more prominent. So how do you see this moving? Do you think that the different models will become more aligned because of this, or do you think there will still be real ideological differences?
It's a great question, Inge. So I think in certain domains we see a move towards convergence, and I would highlight antitrust. So even though the United States has been a very quiet and reluctant to deploy its antitrust powers vis-a-vis the big tech, and has really left it for the Europeans to police this market, we have now seen a rather dramatic change with the DOJ and the FTC both bringing actions against Google and Facebook respectively, potentially demanding very drastic remedies. Whether this will actually lead to a change we still are facing with a rather conservative judiciary. I am not sure if US judges are ready for an antitrust revolution, but there's certainly a different conversation about it. We have different conversations in the US Congress that is calling for revitalizing the American antitrust laws. So there's certainly the way we think about and talk about tech in the antitrust context has changed. And it's interesting that where there's very little agreement among the Republicans and the Democrats, there's probably two things that they agree in. One, we need to be tough on China. And second, the big tech has become too powerful. So there's some possibility that we are moving closer. We've seen also progress on issues that were very just really difficult to bridge very recently, like digital tax. Now the Biden administration has indicated the US's willingness to discuss within the OECD a broader global tax reform. So there are some openings in coming closer to one another. I omitted to mention that also China has been starting to crack on big tech through antitrust laws. So we see, even with China, potentially an agreement there. There's a new privacy law in works in China. The Chinese are growing more conscious on privacy. I don't think we are going to see the end of surveillance and alignment when it comes to any more sort of democratic notion of uncensored speech online. So there may be domains of the digital economy where we see more alignment, and then there's probably the persisting differences on others.
Great, thank you. I see there is a question from Mark Rotenberg in the chat. Mark, if you like, you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly to make the session a bit more dynamic.
Thank you. It's a wonderful presentation. I also want to say I enjoyed your book very much. Deep insight about Brussels, particularly as far as emerging technology. So I wanted to ask your view of the proposed AI regulation, which has an impact similar to that of the GDPR. And a related question with regard to the US, where I wish we had a bit more coherence in our AI policy. It seems that Eric Schmidt has taken on the role of representing the US at conferences on AI policy. I was wondering if there was someone else you would nominate in the US government or an agency that should appropriately have that role.
Terrific, Mark. Excellent question. So whether the AI will have the similar effect to the GDPR, I've thought about this a fair bit, and my sense is that the AI is so multifaceted and the applications are so different. So there is likely not a wholesale answer where we would see a Brussels effect across all the applications of the AI. But fundamentally, good AI algorithms rely on extensive data set. The bigger data set you have, the better you can train your algorithms. And there is a sort of a foundation for the Brussels effect and the global impact of the EU regulation. Because if you want to use European data as part of the rest of the data you use to train your algorithms, you need to apply the European standards across the board. The question is, do you want to retrain your data for Europe and separate that kind of data and create different algorithms? Then you might be able to limit your compliance to Europe alone. But there's a wealth of data that these companies are willing to use that comes from Europe, and that will give them the incentive to apply the European framework. So I think that will push us towards greater European global influence, at least across some applications. The second, Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, has been heading this the AI committee in the United States that was convened in 2018, and that just released its over 700-page report to the US Congress in March. It is true that he has been very vocal in calling out the United States of losing, like basically dropping its guard and not being adequately concerned that China will overtake the United States unless the US will heavily start investing in artificial intelligence. That report also focuses a lot on military applications and the geopolitical battle that is going on with the AI. I think in many ways he is a spokesperson for the United States. But if you look at, for instance, what the Federal Trade Commission is doing, very recently the FTC issued its own guidance on artificial intelligence, reminding everyone that the FTC already under current laws has powers to challenge the companies that are not ensuring that the algorithms they are using, the AI systems that they are deploying, would not be free of discrimination and bias. So there's certainly a more conversation of the FTC calling for the companies to be more transparent and ensure that they are not deceiving, misleading the consumers by claiming, for instance, that they offer a bias-free algorithm for hiring, and making sure that the data sets are trained so that there's no bias. And should there be a bias, there can be a challenge by the FTC. So there are certain actors from the US government And I would mention here, Mark, also that when the EU issued its own AI regulation, the next day there was a tweet by Jake Sullivan, who is the National Security Advisor for President Biden, welcoming the European regulation and reaffirming the United States' willingness to work with the EU and other like-minded partners. And this is really part of this effort by the Biden administration to work closely with the techno-democracies and halt the more of a Chinese authoritarian way of the internet. So I thought that was a very welcome step if we think about transatlantic alignment and conversation on AI. But great question, Mark.
Thank you. We're actually already running out of time, but I would like to pick up on one question that was asked in the chat about whether we still have a chance to change how these existing platforms work, because it seems that the way their business model is built sort of conflicts with the EU values. So is it too late to regulate them, and how can we redefine some of the business models of these platforms? And this is a question from Laura Drexler. Thank you for this question. So Anu, if you could just maybe provide us with some thoughts on this for like 1-2 minutes, that would be great.
Laura, it's a big question, and it is such a good one that it would deserve more of my attention than a couple of minutes, but let me just share very briefly. I don't think it's too late, but I think it is past due to act much more, since these platforms have become the kind of governors, the self-regulating entities in practice, whereby we have not really limited the way they develop their business models. So the regulators have woken up very late in the United States to the dangers and downsides of the digital economy that is entirely self-governing. So we will see if the US would actually want to act. One conversation in the US is that antitrust provides the opportunity to break up these companies. That one issue that we cannot control them well as long as they are this big. But if we can put them into pieces and basically undo Facebook's acquisition of Instagram or WhatsApp, that is the start and the only path forward. The Europeans, in many ways, have been trying to ramp up the pressure, for instance, through Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. The DMA, the Digital Markets Act, is based on the recognition that the existing tools have not been enough. And we really need to be more proactive and regulate these, as opposed to just try to do it one by one through very time-consuming and largely ineffective enforcement actions. So we see the regulators building their arsenal, and it may take a little while to see whether that actually will fundamentally change something. But it really, I welcome your question, because it is unprecedented of how few people control so much about our daily lives and how consequential for individual societies and democratic systems the decisions that these companies make ultimately are. So the regulators need to be more creative, more effective, and much more ambitious if they want to take over the reins.
Great, thanks a lot, Anu. This was a very inspiring talk and a very inspiring discussion, and there is still a lot of things for further food for thought, but I'm afraid I will have to close this session here now. So thanks a lot. In about 10 minutes from now, the next sessions will start. If you're interested in continuing the discussion with Anu, we have a panel coming up in the competition and market regulation track, where Anu is also one of the panelists, and we'll be discussing how to regulate digital platforms. But of course, the other tracks also have very interesting sessions coming up. So have a look at the program and make your choice. For now, thanks everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate it.